A mysterious weather phenomenon has been discovered worldwide. It's as deadly as a tornado, but there's no way to prepare for its killer blasts of wind.
The aircraft banked almost 90 degrees to the left.
The unknown winds rush from menacing skies straight towards the ground. With a force of more than 100 miles per hour, the downburst affects everything in its path.
It may not be as powerful as a tornado. We know they're killers.
I do have a wind shear. I'm going to go to maximum throttle.
The Phantom Beast counts houses, trees, and most importantly, commercial jets as victims.
We saw individuals that looked like they were just lying on the ground sleeping. It was a war zone.
Almost undetectable.
Ground's coming up at you a mile a minute, and wham.
Almost never solved.
The pilots had no inkling that there was even anything out there.
Its destructive path is unmistakable.
All of a sudden, I hear this plane cracking through trees, and I just knew that all my neighbors were dead.
A team of scientists are on a frantic dash to find and prevent this killer burst of wind from beating them to the finish line and adding more lives to its deadly tally. Wind, an element constantly surrounding the Earth. An interruption of static air that is fluid, always moving, with change as a constant companion. The breeze of spring's first warm day, but also the bone-chilling gusts of winter's night. The wind is a complication of mysteries, but these Sentry Guard monuments might hold the key to unlocking nature's elusive gusts, and their story is as amazing as the dangerous winds they shadow. June 24th, 1975 is a typical lazy summer day in New York City. Baseball bats are cracking, taxis are honking, and vacationers are packing roads and airways with heavy bags and light minds.
We were going to Sicily, to Italy, to visit my grandparents. We boarded the plane in New Orleans and headed to New York. The weather was nice, beautiful sunny day.
Eastern Airlines Flight 66 takes off from New Orleans at 1:19 p.m. The plane reaches cruising altitude within minutes, and the flight crew slips into their normal routine. Passengers relax, their comfort a direct reflection of the clear day and turbulence-free ride. After what seems like only a short trip, EA-66 is cleared to land at JFK Airport in Jamaica, New York, around 4 p.m.
Kennedy weather VFR, sky partially obscured, estimated ceiling 4,000 broken.
Kennedy Airport, New York, on Long Island, a preferred location where thunderstorms form, and a relatively innocuous thunderstorm formed in the vicinity of the approach path. There were several aircraft that came in ahead and landed.
Eastern Flight 902, which had tried to land minutes earlier, claimed a pretty good shear had pushed them down to the right.
On approach to New York, it changed the weather. There was a thunderstorm. I just remember seeing lightning.
There was a significant wind shear that occurred on the approach. The flight crew did their best to take care of the maneuver, but they were unable to overcome the wind shear.
The action aircraft continued on, flight crew believing that they could get through the storm, and unfortunately crashed short of the runway.
I remember kind of putting my hand out, you know, like when you're in a car and you're braking. I just remember being forward, like a nosedive. And then after that, I don't remember anything. It wasn't for a couple of days that I woke up. They had told me that we were in an accident and that my mother had died. My sister survived for a few days.
Flight 66 was carrying 124 passengers and crew members. 113 persons perished, victims of mystifying weather, possibly a wind shear.
Any change in wind is just called wind shear. But what was unique about the story was that there were some airplanes that went in right before the one that crashed, Eastern 66, who didn't have trouble. That was the amazing thing about it. How could one plane land and 1 minute later another plane crash?
A killer wind shear was thought to be too wide in diameter to affect only one plane. But there was no other way to explain the fatal crash. No tornadoes had been reported, and lightning was ruled out as a factor. Officials were hesitant to completely blame invisible weather, but they could see a pilot at the controls of a downed jetliner. The National Transportation Safety Board, responsible for investigating U.S. airline crashes, cited the flight crew's delayed recognition and correction as cause of the accident.
Basic cause of the accident was the flight crews continuing the approach into adverse weather from which they did not recover, and they crashed into the approach lights short of the runway.
Prior to that time, we hadn't lost a lot of airplanes to known wind shear. Generally, it was considered to be either an aircraft problem or a piloting problem as opposed to a meteorological event.
There always seems to be the jumping to the conclusion that it's pilot error. And of course, we are all comrades, and we do stay together. We know we've had this good training, and I would think that you'd find in most cases it's not pilot error.
Refusing to agree with the government's decision to blame the flight crew, one of those comrades decided to take action. Homer Mowden was a retired Braniff Airways captain, now with the Flight Safety Foundation. He tried to forget the mysterious wind reports surrounding the crash, but they would not disappear from his conscience. He took his concerns to the University of Chicago and world-renowned meteorologist Dr. Ted Fujita.
So he came to Fujita and said, Professor Fujita, I think the weather did this. And Fujita, he was about to leave town that day, but Mowden was persistent, and finally something clicked in Fujita's mind. He didn't travel that day. He got so excited about it.
Fujita was a very fun-loving guy. Talk about getting excited about weather. Any little thing about the weather, he'd just jump up and down with joy and have a great time.
Fujita was just absolutely an amazing man, and because he had the ability, like no other person ever in the meteorological world, of seeing things and how they all fit together in ways that no one could do.
Fujita was no stranger to horrific accident scenes. His eyes had long ago been trained to look past the death and mayhem and focus on distinctive damage patterns left in the destruction. Mowden's description ignited a path of association blowing back to his early years when he was one of Japan's brightest young scientists.
When the atomic bomb was dropped and the Japanese government was trying to figure out exactly what happened, and he was the person that went out and investigated.
He went there and examined all the damage patterns, and at that time he realized that, of course, the damage patterns were moving outward, sort of divergent from the point of explosion.
He went from studying the bomb explosion patterns in Japan and trying to figure out where exactly the bomb was dropped to studying tornado patterns in the United States.
Fujita had become something of a cult hero for his work in cyclone research over the years, inspiring the nickname Dr. Tornado. During countless hours spent flying in observational planes over bent cornfields, snapped-off trees, and demolished houses, Fujita had become an expert at identifying the telltale signs left by a tornado's path. But he had recently noticed a mysterious new pattern in his damage surveys, one that oddly looked much like Hiroshima, and even more strange, the Eastern Airlines data he was poring over.
Looking down at tornado damage, which is a twisting, converging wind damage, where the winds come together and swirl. Instead of seeing that pattern, he saw what looked like starburst patterns, where the wind comes down and splatters the trees outward instead of inward, diverging outward in all directions.
He said, well, that's not a tornado. And then when he saw what happened to Eastern 66, which is a sudden very rapid descent into the ground. He said, I wonder if that's related.
What if a freakish, mysterious wind blew straight down out of a storm cell, strong enough to push an airplane right out of the sky? What if the wind was a previously unknown type of shear, so concentrated in its burst, it left little whirls upon slamming into the ground? And what if it occurred frequently, making every airline flight a Russian roulette-like dance with death? As with most reactions to change, his hypothesis landed on less than accepting ears.
There were many different schools of thought at that time. We all knew that air came down out of thunderstorms and spread out. What was unusual is that Fujita was saying that this strong diverging wind could take place over such a small distance, 200 yards, a half mile.
We initially kind of scoffed at some of Fujita's ideas as well, because we looked at some of his pictures and some of his scenarios, and it didn't quite seem to fit.
It came across as skepticism, which it was, but we made a big error. Fujita's genius really was in his observational capabilities.
Fujita refused to be deterred by the skepticism. He had long been considered a non-conventional scientist.
He wasn't interested in working with lots of equations or computer simulations. All of his science was the utilization of his eyes. And from that, guessing, hypothesizing, speculating what was going on inside.
Fujita was an unabashed theorizer, and oftentimes he was wrong. But he knew he was not alone in his scientific alienation this time. The signs of a small burst of downdraft wind had been observed for centuries.
Well, believe it or not, Leonardo da Vinci, back in the real early days, actually sketched out pictures of violent downdrafts with the air coming out. They did recognize that thunderstorms produce very strong downdrafts and damaging winds.
There was an English mariner who did a woodblock of a storm at sea, which has all the appearance of a downdraft and an outflow so intense it creates little whirls.
Pilots sometimes felt the sinking effects of these mysterious bursts, not realizing just how close they were to disaster. Since the inception of flight in the early 1900s, wind has served as both friend and foe to the aviation community.
Well, pilots, even from the days of the Wright brothers, understood that rapid changes in winds are definitely an aviation hazard.
Pilots were very much aware of, it was called a sinker. They'd be on approach, and all of a sudden the bottom would fall out, and they would just sink.
I flew for 37 years. I knew that it was something we had already experienced out there, but just had not put a name with it. And I feel like we just coped with it without knowing, exactly what it was.
The deadly invisible burst of wind was beginning to bare its cruel teeth. But it had yet to be concretely observed, let alone named, when it struck again. In August of 1975, a Continental jet was pushed down in Denver upon takeoff. The next year, another jet was hit in Philadelphia. The mysterious wind could materialize in a heartbeat, and with lives hanging in the balances, Fujita was one man on a crusade to change the minds of institutions. Just how long would the journey be? And how many more would have to die along the way? The mysterious crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 66 in 1975 killed 113 people and left a permanent impression on scientists baffled by the seemingly invisible cause. A small, rushing burst of wind, moving straight down from above, forced the plane to crash in a burst of flames. University of Chicago professor Ted Fujita was an expert in proving new theories about tornadoes, but he had made this mysterious wind his new mission, and he knew if he didn't find evidence of the deadly burst soon, more air passengers would almost certainly die.
My boss, he told me about Fujita's discovery, and I said, well, I think that perhaps Doppler radars could detect that and measure its intensity. I went to Chicago and talked to Fujita. And he got very excited about it and began to develop plans for an experiment in Chicago.
The ever-enthusiastic Fujita had a way with catchy words. He called his project the Northern Illinois Meteorological Research on Downburst, or Nimrod for short. In the Bible, Nimrod was described as a mighty hunter, but the scientists were about to find a killer more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Using 3 radars, Project Nimrod urgently began in the summer of 1978 near O'Hare Airport in Chicago, Illinois. Fujita and his team spent day and night huddled over computer screens, hoping to snare one of the killer winds with their Doppler radar technology.
People, when they hear a train approaching and then receding, the sound will change in pitch. And that's a similar effect the radar has. It has the ability to tell whether those raindrops are moving toward or away from the radar using the Doppler effect.
If Fujita's downburst model was correct, the Doppler effect could be used to detect its existence by measuring the particles being carried in its rushing wind. The radar sends out a signal that detects if the rain particles are moving towards or away from the dish in opposite directions. They set up their radars in a wide triangle, unsure about the size of the killer burst.
Just like catching a fish. If you're going to catch a small fish, use a net with small holes. If you're going to catch a big fish, you can go with a net with bigger holes. Well, in Nimrod, they weren't sure how big this fish was, and so they didn't put out a very fine net to catch it.
The long days turned into longer weeks, the winds constantly whipped by their weather stations, tantalizing the scientists with their potential to be the killer downdraft of air. Every thunderstorm that formed could hold a deadly burst in its dark belly, and Fujita was on a mission to prove it was there lurking.
So, of course, we've been waiting and waiting. And on May 29th, there was a thunderstorm just, a couple miles away. And so we swung the radar around to start scanning it.
The thunderstorm was moving rapidly straight towards the scientists. As the dish scanned back and forth, it suddenly saw movement. Tense eyes focused on the radar screen, wondering if they were finally seeing the deadly wind.
This was just one big bullseye of air coming towards us very fast. So, geez, we got all excited seeing the radar, so we rushed outside to see it. What this thing, what we were going to see, we didn't know. The radar was located on a farm pond. It was right next to it. And we ran out, and just as we ran out, the wind gust, and it almost blew us into the lake.
The scientists were numb with the excitement of discovery. They had actually seen and felt the rushing downburst of wind that Fujita felt was responsible for knocking airplanes out of the sky. In the haste of trying to locate and see the deadly burst, the discovery had remained nameless. Fujita dubbed the killer wind a microburst for its relatively small size of less than 2.5 miles across.
When you encounter some of these shears, micro is not the word you would associate with what just happened to you. It would be more like macro. But in terms of meteorology, I can understand why they would call it a microburst, because they're thinking of the area in which it occurs.
Project Nimrod was a resounding success. Entering the field study, Fujita had only theorized about the powerful downdraft. But over the summer of 1978, he and his team were able to prove its existence and also get a clear picture of how dangerous the microburst really was. A microburst first starts in the upper reaches of a thunderstorm. Raindrops are formed by warm air pushed upwards and then rapidly cooled by the atmosphere. When the raindrops become heavier than the air, they begin to fall.
And it's falling thousands of feet, and as the air gets colder and colder and the precip falls, it just starts accelerating.
When you get into really, really strong situations, you can get downdrafts around the order of 100 miles an hour. And then it hits the ground and it's got to go somewhere, so out it goes, swooshing out to the sides.
The microburst wind started to get more attention from the weather community. Papers were published, doctorates were awarded, and the scientists left the field study sure that the Federal Aviation Administration would fund further studies to make airways safe.
We just still didn't know much about them. Didn't know much about what caused them. Certainly didn't know anything about their climatology. What's their characteristics? How strong are they?
But the FAA didn't take the scientists' reports seriously enough. They had been working on a system to detect what they thought was the problem, a different type of wind shear called a gust front. Wind shear is the general term for any change in wind speed, and a gust front is a large-scale, cool breeze that blows from the leading edge of a thunderstorm. But a microburst is a powerful, small-scale event.
After the John F. Kennedy crash in the 1970s, the FAA did develop the low-level wind shear alert system, which was primarily a network of about 5 or 6 wind sensors around an airport.
The system was designed to detect the gust front, which is like a single line of wind moving across an airport, which it was able to do. Problem is it couldn't detect a microburst.
The low-level wind shear anemometers were set up too far apart to detect microbursts. Airplanes kept landing, airplanes kept taking off, and in larger and larger numbers every year. Meteorologists knew that the FAA was sitting on a time bomb, and without a sufficient warning system, a jet crash could be imminent, taking more lives and public confidence down with it. The shifting winds of 1979 would bring new hope to NCAR's Boulder, Colorado headquarters. John McCarthy was not only a meteorologist, but also a pilot. And the tall, outgoing scientist was convinced further research on microbursts must be done, and soon.
Something's wrong here. The FAA is putting the wind shear program to bed because they think they've solved it, and we don't think it's solved at all. And we've got to do something.
Without backing from the FAA, the scientists of NCAR planned a study of their own to be conducted in Colorado in the summer of 1982. Dubbed the Joint Airport Weather Studies, or JAWS, the field project would involve some of the brightest minds in meteorology.
During the JAWS studies, we want to know how strong is it, how does it affect the aircraft, how many are there, and its name JAWS came out not too long after the movie JAWS, and so we were always thinking about something coming out of the ground and grabbing and pulling airplanes out of the sky. So it definitely had a eerie feeling that we were dealing with something that was truly hazardous.
Fujita, Jim Wilson, and John McCarthy would be the lead scientists in JAWS. They knew that this time they needed to see more microbursts, particularly so they could understand the effect they had on commercial jets. They gambled and put their 3 radars closer together than anyone really felt comfortable with. Graduate students, fellows, and meteorologists assembled in the Colorado foothills, ready to pan for microburst riches.
We were looking at a very small area, and there was a lot of speculation that maybe we might not see very many of these things, just a few of them. And in fact, we saw all we needed and more.
We had a bonanza of microbursts. They were everywhere. We couldn't believe it. And so we then began to wonder, well, how come there weren't lots of accidents?
We knew how strong they were, and we knew from our own experience that they were an aviation hazard. And you think about aircraft operations, one after the next every few minutes. The chance of encountering one is small, but there are still going to be several that could be encountered head-on by an aircraft in any given airport in any given summer.
They fought through the fatigue, needing only to look past the wind swirls across the flatlands to nearby Denver Stapleton Airport. The vision of thousands of people unknowingly putting their lives in danger every day was like bottled adrenaline.
On an approach, the aircraft is very slow. It's trying to maintain just enough speed to land on the runway. So what happens, the airplane comes in the wind flow, its nose goes up a little bit while the pilot's trying to land, so they typically react by putting the nose down. Then you hit the downdraft. And the downdraft starts pushing on the aircraft, and then it starts accelerating downward. And then just about the time the pilot's trying to react to the downdraft, you get a tailwind, and then boom, the lift is gone, and the plane starts essentially falling like a rock.
The scientists' discoveries always return to the lingering realization that the wind is everywhere. And wherever there was a thunderstorm, there could be a microburst. Like the silent screams in a nightmare, The handcuffed scientist had no way to warn the thousands of planes flying every day.
I was driving back from the radar site and I heard about the crash on the radio, and I pulled off the side of the road. And then I put my hands over my face and I said, "Oh my God."
The summer wind, a breeze filled with the hope of warm days ahead. In 1982, in Boulder, Colorado, scientists from the National Center for Atmospheric Research were hoping for something different. An answer to combat the microburst, a wind phenomenon that had killed over 100 people in the previous 7 years. The Federal Aviation Administration were sure they had solved the problem, but the scientists knew they hadn't. And on July 9th, the debate would come to a fiery climax. Kenner, Louisiana, a suburb of New Orleans, where the only relief from the thick, sticky air are the frequent thunderstorms.
In New Orleans, after the heat builds up, in the evening, you could typically almost set your watch by it that you would have a thunderstorm come through.
Pan Am Flight 759, on a stopover en route to Las Vegas, was filled with passengers, baggage, and a full tank of fuel.
There was a thunderstorm progressing through the area. At the time that they got their first weather report, the winds were calm.
Time 1855 Zulu, weather visibility 6 miles in haze, temperature 90, wind 240 at 2.
And about the time of takeoff, the thunderstorm had moved essentially over the departure into the runway.
The crew got takeoff clearance, pushed the throttles up. That's just about the point that the wind shear started to occur. The airplane lifted off, got up into the air 90 to 100 feet. It was climbing out, but at very low airspeed.
Come on back, you're sinking down.
There was a tree right at the beginning of this subdivision, way past the end of the runway. It's just that the aircraft was still that low. And as the aircraft was beginning to gain altitude, it struck the top edge of these trees. The right side kept going up, the left side went down, and the plane went into a bank.
I was out on my patio in the back, and all of a sudden I hear this plane cracking through the trees. It was popping like the motor couldn't get revved up good. And so I saw the plane falling. The wingtip hit my street, and that's when it broke loose, and all the fuel emptied out from there on. And all I could see was the flames. I saw nothing, no houses, no nothing in front of me. And I just knew that all my neighbors were dead.
145 innocent passengers and crew members, along with 8 people on the ground, died as a result of the deadly microburst. There were no survivors. The NCAR researchers who had been so optimistically studying microburst just days earlier found it hard to accept, especially when it was revealed that New Orleans had been using the FAA's low-level wind shear alert system.
New Orleans in '82, there was an LWAS system present, and the microburst came right down in the middle of the airport, right over the top of the center anemometer, and it didn't produce a warning.
We determined that basically the LWAS system had its limitations. The algorithms that were in the LWAS were not the types that were required to detect a microburst.
The wind had brought the microburst story to a crossroads. They were now listed as the cause of over 250 U.S. air carrier passenger deaths. The FAA knew their solution didn't work, and there could be no excuses about ignorance to the phenomenon now.
It always takes a large-scale incident before everybody wakes up and then says, we're all going to sing from the same sheet of music, let's fix this problem. Well, at that time, in 1982, that was the incident.
The joint airport weather studies came to a close. The program had been a sobering success. Over 90 microbursts had been seen, but the scientists in Colorado had made another startling discovery. Some of the killer winds were almost invisible to the naked eye. They dubbed them dry microbursts. In a wet microburst, the phenomenon occurs in a humid environment where moisture is easily seen as a rain shaft hitting the ground. In a dry microburst, the thunderstorm is usually in a less humid climate, and the dry air forces the rain to evaporate, making winds that are as great, if not greater, than a wet microburst, nearly invisible.
That was the scary part. Pilots certainly have enough sense to avoid the dangers that they can see, but in this case, there would be a danger that couldn't be seen.
After the JAWS project ended, the National Science Foundation advised that an industry-wide training program be implemented for pilots. John McCarthy also wanted to further develop the radar detection system, making the Doppler automatic so that it could be practically deployed, protecting airports nationwide.
We found out that you could absolutely detect a microburst with a Doppler weather radar, period.
We knew that radar could detect microbursts. We knew that the existing systems probably weren't adequate for all of the functions that we wanted. But then we had to turn it into an operational system.
After 8 long years of study, the microburst phenomenon seems so close to being understood, but still light years away from being solved. The stealthy killer wind was proving to be a silent assassin. And on August 1st, 1983, President Ronald Reagan and Air Force One would find out firsthand after they landed at Andrews Air Force Base.
An anemometer on the Air Force Base measured 110 knot wind. And if you imagine that there was an opposing wind at the other end of the airport of even half that strength, we're talking about a 100 to 200 mile per hour microburst.
If Air Force One had been coming in sooner, the president would have been probably killed in the microburst. It was a very powerful one.
Still, the average person didn't fully grasp the power and danger of a microburst. Unlike tornadoes or even thunderstorms, it was having trouble achieving the folklore status normally associated with severe storms.
There's a lot of lore about tornadoes, and they do get a lot of respect, and a lot of times the microbursts play second fiddle to a tornado. Just because microburst, the micro sounds small, and it may not be as powerful sounding as a tornado or a severe thunderstorm, we know they're killers.
The microburst was recognized as an unsolved killer in aviation, but the nation would begin to hear more and more about these phantom winds as the cause of other deaths. On July 7th, 1984, in Huntington, Alabama, a boat was hit broadside by a microburst. 11 people were trapped and drowned, victims of an unseen killer.
It can be a problem anywhere. If you get a very strong outflow of air, it can knock down trees, it can knock over trailers. People die from microbursts, just like they do from tornadoes.
Powerful, deadly, and sometimes invisible, the microburst was creating its own category in wicked weather lore. John McCarthy and the team from NCAR were trapped at a critical stage. Find a way to make radar detection practical for airports to start saving lives, and develop a training program to help pilots survive if they did get caught in the deadly burst of wind.
Cleared for takeoff, runway 26, United 767 Heavy. 500 foot, climbing. I do have a wind shear. I'm going to go to maximum throttle.
This is the captain. I'd like to ask that you remain seated.
Okay, gentlemen, nice job. I've got the simulator on freeze. I'm going to put us back on the ground, and we'll talk about that last wind shear event.
The wind can play the parts of both pleasant breeze and forceful killer. But the pilots in this flight simulator were lucky. They could turn off crash reality with the flip of a switch. They were part of a team of researchers trying to find a way to fly through a microburst, a killer blast of wind that had taken almost 300 lives. So far, their cockpit experiences only supported the raw fear of pilots who had felt the powerful downburst winds firsthand.
It just feels like you're in the Tower of Doom. Everything's just dropping. Usually when you exit the microburst, it's a very sharp change. You're falling and then boom. It's just like the bottom came back up.
Perhaps the best thing I could associate it with is when you're driving down a highway and you crest a hill unexpectedly and you get that kind of sinking feeling as the car goes over the hill and you get a little light in the seat of your pants for just a few seconds.
There had to be a way to fly out of a microburst. and industry officials thought they had found a procedure that just might work. But they had to convince the FAA to adopt the cause.
When you work in safety, you become very involved in the safety process. And you become very focused on not the death and destruction, but your mind immediately switches to, how are we going to fix this?
Pilots blasted by a microburst are caught in a devastatingly fast shift in wind speed. First from a headwind, then the telltale downdraft, and lastly, a wicked kick from a tailwind. In a really strong microburst, there was almost no chance for survival.
Several times through the process, I was frustrated. I was the one that was given the responsibility to manage the program, and so I'd say every day I was worried that it wasn't going to work.
A training program to teach pilots how to fly through a microburst encounter was being prepared for FAA approval, but the best alternative was to avoid the big winds altogether. A radar practical for widespread use at airports, however, had to be practically automated. Safety researcher John McCarthy knew he had the tool to do it: Doppler weather radar. In the summer of 1984, the FAA challenged him to demonstrate it. Denver Stapleton Airport would be the proving grounds.
We started producing live microburst alerts. We had meteorologists in the radar, and we had meteorologists in the tower. They'd radio the location of the microburst. We'd draw it on a map. We'd hand it to the controller. The controller would broadcast it to the pilot. Undoubtedly, it made a big impression.
We also crafted a survey form that we handed out to pilots. There was one in particular from a pilot that the phrase in his writing was, "This warning saved my aircraft." Well, that did it. You know, if it's this good, then we'll pursue this and we'll wrestle this thing to the ground until it's done.
The terminal Doppler weather radar was such an obvious lifesaver. There's no way the FAA could ignore the results.
Well, this was really the first step to turning a scientific tool into an air traffic control instrument that can be used by pilots and controllers.
As with any bureaucratic system, just because the technical department of the FAA wanted to do something didn't mean that the people that had the money at the FAA wanted to do it.
It's frustrating when we know of solutions that can solve problems, yet the money's not there to do it. I thought the bureaucracy was horrible.
Nature pays no heed to the timetables of men. On August 2nd, 1985, the accident that many thought could have been prevented wasn't.
Every year, my wife Carol and I go backpacking. On our last night, I had a dream that there had been a terrible wind shear accident. I told her in the morning. She said, you're nuts, you know. You've been working wind shear too long. So we got in the car and turned on the radio, and sure enough,
at least 122 people were killed when a Delta Airlines jumbo jet crashed into a field last night on final approach to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport.
The microburst had unleashed its deadly power once again. This was the second major accident due to microbursts in 3 years. Americans were angry and scared, and the public would not sit by and watch more of their friends and family die.
The whole accident could have been avoided. The plane was very, very close to the runway. It was a matter of seconds more, and probably nobody would have been killed or hurt.
The accident in '85 was a major wake-up call that it was time to take more definitive action.
The turning point was a level of public awareness that we need to do something. Everybody at the FAA decided to move forward, not just the technical part, but the people with the purse strings.
The FAA made a very quick decision to go and implement a national system.
Led by United Airlines, pilot training would be the quickest program to get approved. The Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas Aircraft Corporations had spent months on the proper escape maneuver.
The escape maneuver we came up with was something that the pilot could easily remember and operate.
They found out that you could very gingerly pull back and increase the pitch of the aircraft by basically trading altitude for airspeed. And that gave you a greater chance to penetrate this event, which lasts only about 30 seconds.
It really gave you a lot of confidence, knowing that it would fly out of the most extreme situation that you'd probably ever get into.
The wind shear training aid, the first major blow to the killer downburst winds, was officially adopted by the FAA in 1987. The scientists were halfway to their goal. The other step was avoiding the deadly burst altogether. But detecting the invisible winds wasn't easy, and the terminal Doppler weather radar had yet to be refined as an automated system. One of the scientists who was brought in for this critical phase had a familiar face. Ted Fujita, now nearing 70 years old, had first hypothesized about the existence of a microburst wind over 10 years earlier. The researchers built test radars that they moved to locations in Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida. At each stop, they were amazed at how the automatic systems worked.
Within a minute, the TDWR is detecting the microburst. The processor builds this picture of what's going on out there, and then it's that picture that's ultimately put up on a graphical display and on a textual display for use up in the control towers, and the controller actually reads it off on a ribbon display within 2 minutes of that event occurring. So it's very rapid turnaround.
After years of research, frustrated attempts to raise money, and skepticism from all sides, the microburst scientists seem to have finally reached their summit. The FAA contracted with Raytheon Corporation to build the TDWR radar at 45 airports over the next several years. But there would be some unforeseen problems with saving lives. Trying to get these systems installed would become a neck-to-neck race with the killer microburst. And with increased public attention, the margin for error would be zero. The winds of change rise and fall. In the late 1980s, the FAA's terminal Doppler weather radar system had proven able to detect and alert pilots of microburst incidents, allowing them the ability to wait for takeoffs and landings, and almost assuredly saving lives. 45 systems were scheduled for commission, but to be most effective, the TDWR had to be 5 to 10 miles from the airport, and that meant acquiring land. Nature's invisible killer would be sure to strike again if the FAA didn't have better luck in the real estate market.
The biggest problem that we had was land acquisition. We had to do an environmental assessment at every site. We found Indian artifacts at one site, so we had to abandon that site. Endangered species at several sites. It was the gopher tortoises in Florida that we had to deal with. If you're 10 miles away from an airport, where do you find open land?
FAA researchers tried to focus on setting up the TDWR building projects. Just when they were starting to make progress, their hopes were crushed again. On July 9, 1994, 37 people died when a microburst caused a plane to crash on approach at Charlotte International Airport. A TDWR had been scheduled for installation, but the land procurement had fallen through. The microburst threat was still there, and 9 years of silence hadn't diminished its killing chokehold. Just up the road at Langley Air Force Base, NASA was hard at work on a solution for airports without a TDWR system. They were testing a look-ahead radar that could be installed in the nose cone of commercial jets. To test the system, they would have to actually fly through a microburst at high altitude.
On the very first penetration, there was a strong rain shaft. I had a sensation of excitement. This was going to be the first time that we actually got real data in the real atmosphere on how well these sensors could predict the performance hit that the airplane would take.
You would fly into it, and you could feel the settling of the airplane. A lot of the people in the back were initially a little concerned about it. By the time they were getting up to the second year of flight testing and had gone through some, they were actually looking forward to flying bigger ones.
NASA found they could utilize their onboard look-ahead radar using equipment already on airplanes. This gave pilots the ability to get 10 to 30 seconds advance warning of a wind shear event, even when flying into airports without a TDWR system.
About 2 years after we finished our flight test, the first wind shear systems were certified. They're now flying on practically every U.S. commercial jet transport.
The deadly microburst winds have been silent for almost 10 years. The FAA was finally able to install 45 TDWR systems nationwide. You can see the radars close to most United States airports, distinguished by their golf ball on stilts exterior. All new aircraft is required to have a look-ahead warning system. And if a plane should get caught in a deadly microburst, pilots receive extensive training on how to fly out alive on the other end.
It's one of the few times when we can look back and point at something we did and say, this really made a big difference. The wind shear problem hasn't gone away. For the most part, however, we've been very effective in treating the microburst problem.
No atmospheric problem can ever be truly solved, for the weather is as mysterious as the wind that spirits it across our earthly globe. But the microburst is now widely recognized, making nature's invisible killer a frequent mention in accidents unassociated with airplanes.
These microbursts are only a few hundred feet wide, if that. Kind of an interesting pattern. By the time we know about it, it's gone.
NASA has even speculated that wind shear could have been a factor in the crash of Space Shuttle Columbia, February 1st, 2003. Though it has since been discounted, investigators initially looked into whether wind shear weakened the left wing at liftoff, eventually causing the craft to disintegrate, killing all 7 astronauts on board. Almost 30 years have passed since Ted Fujita first hypothesized about a microburst wind. Though he died in November of 1998, Fujita did live long enough to grasp the satisfaction that so often eludes those in the scientific community. Those with the opportunity to help solve the microburst problem pulled off a rare feat. In little more than 10 years, they watched their project go from paper and pencil to directly saving lives.
Well, we were having an accident about every 18 months and a major fatal about every 2.5 years. We all sat down and we fixed it, and we ended up with one of the best aviation safety fixes that many of us can cite.
I think it's one of the most exciting programs I was ever involved in my life. In the U.S., since 1987, I think we may have had one accident that could have been attributed to wind shear. So that's almost a 20-fold improvement in the accident rate. That's unheard of in history.
For a scientist to actually, in his lifetime, to experience a problem coming up, going out there and actually observing and understanding what the problem is, and then having implemented a procedure, there can't be anything any more rewarding to a scientist to really work on such a practical problem and see it all come to fruition. It's very exciting.
I had a boss once that said, as engineers in the FAA, we have our own monuments. You know, we don't have a statue in the town square, but we can go driving around the country and we can go looking at radar systems, and those are our monuments. We have them all around, and then we ought to take pride in that.
Powerful, unpredictable, and deadly, the microburst is a weather phenomenon to be feared and respected, a force of wind so distinctive in shape and property that it can never be ignored again. But it is a storm that was met with an equally impressive force. A team of engineers and scientists who made all the right sacrifices to save lives. They could not tame nature's invisible killer, but they could map its tendencies and explore its workings, making the skies and airways safe for all who fly in the future.